Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Long before the Founding Fathers gathered in Philadelphia to draft the Constitution, the roots of American democracy were already taking shape, quietly but powerfully, in the early colonial settlements. From the windswept decks of the Mayflower to the bustling halls of Virginia's House of Burgesses, settlers were experimenting with self-rule, civic participation, and shared governance. These were not yet the democratic ideals enshrined in the Constitution, but they were critical first steps toward it. In New England, town meetings gave ordinary citizens a voice in local affairs. In the South, representative assemblies allowed colonists to challenge governors and shape their own laws. Even amid hardship and uncertainty, these early Americans were building institutions based on consent of the governed, accountability, and participation. In this video, we'll explore how those early experiments, born from necessity, shaped by geography and guided by both religious and Enlightenment thinking, laid the groundwork for the American democracy we know today. The desire for self-government among the American colonists did not emerge in a vacuum. It was deeply influenced by English political traditions, practical realities, and religious convictions. English settlers brought with them a legacy of political thought that emphasized the rule of law and the rights of individuals. Documents like the Magna Carta of 1215 had long established the principle that even monarchs must obey the law, while the English Bill of Rights of 1689 reinforced parliamentary authority and individual liberties, including the right to petition and protection from cruel punishment. These ideas became part of the colonists' political DNA, shaping their expectations for fair governance and personal freedoms. But geography played an equally crucial role. The vast Atlantic Ocean created an unavoidable gap between the colonies and the English crown. Communication was slow and inconsistent, and enforcement of royal policies was often impractical. As a result, colonists were left to manage their own affairs, electing local councils, forming assemblies, and developing legal systems based on English common law but adapted to their new environment. This necessity bred a culture of autonomy and local control that became a defining feature of colonial life. Religious motivations further fueled the push for self-governance. Groups like the Pilgrims, Puritans, and Quakers had crossed the ocean not just to escape persecution, but to build communities rooted in their spiritual ideals. These communities demanded the freedom to govern according to their faith, which often meant establishing local structures of authority that aligned with their beliefs. In places like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, religious values were woven into political decision-making, reinforcing the idea that governance should reflect the will and morals of the people it served. Through this blend of inherited tradition, practical necessity, and religious vision, the foundations of American self-government began to take shape. As the colonies took root, early democratic experiments began to emerge, each offering a glimpse into what would eventually evolve into a fully developed system of American democracy. One of the first and most symbolic milestones was the Mayflower Compact of 1620. When the Pilgrims landed far north of their intended destination, they faced a precarious situation without a formal charter to govern them. To prevent disorder, they agreed to create their own government through a written pact. The Mayflower Compact established the principle of self-rule by asserting that laws would be made for the good of the colony and that all signers agreed to abide by those laws. Though simple, it marked the first time settlers in the New World had created a government by mutual consent, an early exercise in social contract theory. Meanwhile, in Virginia, another form of self-governance was taking shape. The Virginia House of Burgesses, established in 1619, became the first representative assembly in the American colonies. Composed of elected representatives from each of Virginia's settlements, the House had the authority to pass laws and manage colonial affairs, though its actions were still subject to approval by the royal governor. Even so, it gave colonists a powerful taste of representative government and provided a practical model of how citizens could influence legislation through elected officials. This idea would become central to the democratic system later enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. In New England, democratic participation took a different form. The town meeting. Especially common in Puritan communities, town meetings brought together local residents to discuss and vote directly on matters such as taxes, road repairs, and the appointment of officials. Unlike representative assemblies, these meetings practiced direct democracy, where eligible citizens engaged in open debate and decision-making. This system promoted civic involvement and reinforced the belief that government should reflect the will of the people. Collectively, these early institutions, the Mayflower Compact, the House of Burgesses, and New England's town meetings, demonstrated the colonists' growing commitment to self-rule and laid the groundwork for more complex democratic systems in the future. As the colonies developed, the legal and political frameworks that governed them varied widely, influencing the degree of local autonomy they enjoyed. Colonial governments generally fell into three categories: royal, proprietary, and charter. Each type of colony had a different relationship with the British Crown, and these distinctions played a significant role in shaping local governance. Royal colonies were directly controlled by the king, who appointed a governor to enforce royal policies. In these colonies, the governor held considerable power, but colonial legislatures still played a crucial role, often pushing back against royal authority when local interests were at stake. Proprietary colonies, on the other hand, were granted to individuals or groups by the crown as a kind of political favor. These proprietors had the authority to appoint officials and govern as they saw fit, though they often allowed for elected assemblies to maintain order and gain popular support. Charter colonies, like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, operated under charters granted by the king but were largely self-governing. These colonies enjoyed the greatest autonomy, with colonists electing their governors and legislatures and exercising significant control over their internal affairs. Regardless of the structure, colonial legislatures became powerful engines of local governance. These bodies, typically composed of elected representatives, managed critical functions such as taxation, the creation of laws, and the organization of local defense. Though technically subordinate to the crown, many legislatures operated with minimal interference, especially when Britain was preoccupied with European wars or other colonial concerns. This period of salutary neglect allowed local political institutions to grow stronger and more confident in their independence. Over time, these experiences gave colonists a sense of political competence and entitlement to self-rule. The ability to legislate for themselves, particularly on matters of taxation and defense, became a cornerstone of colonial identity and a major source of friction once Britain tried to reassert control in the years leading up to the American Revolution. By the 18th century, the intellectual climate of the colonies was increasingly shaped by the ideas of the Enlightenment, a European movement that emphasized reason, individual rights, and the potential for progress through knowledge and critical thinking. These philosophical currents found fertile ground in America, where colonists were already accustomed to a degree of self-rule and eager to justify and expand their political freedoms. One of the most influential Enlightenment thinkers was John Locke, whose ideas profoundly shaped colonial attitudes toward government. Locke argued that all individuals are born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and that governments exist only with the consent of the governed to protect those rights. If a government failed in this duty, Locke insisted, people had the right to alter or abolish it. These concepts resonated deeply with colonists, who increasingly viewed their assemblies as legitimate protectors of their rights, while growing wary of royal authority that seemed distant and unaccountable. Another key figure was Montesquieu, whose theory of the separation of powers argued that no single branch of government should hold unchecked authority. He believed dividing power among legislative, executive, and judicial branches was essential to preserving liberty. Colonists embraced this idea, especially as their own political experience demonstrated the risks of concentrated power, whether in the hands of a royal governor or a distant monarch. Montesquieu's ideas would later heavily influence the structure of the U.S. Constitution, but even in the colonial era, they fueled debates about how best to protect freedom and prevent tyranny. The spread of these ideas was accelerated by a booming colonial print culture. Pamphlets, newspapers, and almanacs became powerful tools for circulating political thought and sparking public debate. Writers like Thomas Paine would later popularize revolutionary ideas, but even earlier, the press played a vital role in educating the public about Enlightenment principles and encouraging critical engagement with government. This growing intellectual exchange helped unite disparate colonies under a shared vision of rights, liberty, and representative government, laying the ideological groundwork for the revolution to come. As the 18th century progressed, tensions between the colonies and Britain began to mount, driven by a growing sense that British control was infringing on the rights and autonomy colonists had come to expect. One major source of conflict was economic. Under the policy of mercantilism, Britain sought to tightly control colonial trade to benefit the mother country. The Navigation Acts, a series of laws beginning in the mid-1600s, required that colonial goods be shipped through British ports and transported on British ships. These restrictions limited economic freedom and frustrated merchants who saw greater profit opportunities elsewhere. Although some colonists found ways to circumvent the rules through smuggling, the increasing enforcement of these laws in the 1700s led to deep resentment. Colonists viewed these economic controls not just as inconvenient, but as violations of their right to manage their own prosperity. At the same time, a powerful cultural force was sweeping through the colonies, the Great Awakening. This widespread religious revival emphasized personal faith, emotional connection to God, and the idea that all individuals were equal in the eyes of the divine. Traveling preachers challenged traditional church authority and encouraged people to think for themselves, breaking down long-standing religious hierarchies. But the movement's impact went beyond religion. It nurtured a spirit of individualism and fostered a willingness to question all forms of authority, including political ones. Many who experienced the Great Awakening began to see personal liberty and moral autonomy as divine rights, further reinforcing the foundations of democratic thinking. The final spark that lit the fuse of revolution came after the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. Though Britain emerged victorious, the war left the empire with a massive debt. To recover financially, Parliament imposed a series of taxes on the colonies, including the Stamp Act and the Tea Act. These measures outraged colonists who had grown used to managing their own taxation through local legislatures. The cry of no taxation without representation reflected their belief that such policies violated the principles of self-governance and consent of the governed. What had begun as a desire for local control was rapidly transforming into a full-scale resistance to imperial authority. Each act of British control only deepened colonial unity and pushed the colonies further down the path toward independence. As British policies became more intrusive and colonial anger intensified, the colonies began moving from isolated protests to coordinated political resistance. A key step in this transformation was the formation of the Committees of Correspondence. These informal networks, established in the early 1770s, allowed colonies to share information, coordinate responses to British actions, and build a sense of unity across vast distances. The committees helped turn scattered opposition into a more organized and strategic movement, setting the stage for collective action. That collective action took formal shape with the Continental Congress. First convened in 1774, this body brought together delegates from across the colonies to discuss a unified response to British oppression. The Congress represented a bold new form of political collaboration. It was the first time the colonies acted together in a structured, representative manner. They debated policies, sent petitions to the king, and eventually took the extraordinary step of organizing a continental army. These were not just acts of rebellion, they were declarations of political maturity, reflecting the colonies' growing belief that they were capable of governing themselves without British oversight. This progression reached its most powerful expression in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the document was more than a list of grievances. It was a statement of democratic principle. Drawing heavily on Enlightenment ideas and colonial experience, it asserted that all people are created equal, that they possess unalienable rights, and that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. The Declaration framed the break from Britain not just as a political necessity, but as a moral and philosophical imperative. It was the culmination of decades of self-rule, intellectual evolution, and growing confidence in the colony's capacity for democracy. What had begun with small steps, local assemblies, town meetings, and written compacts, had now grown into a full-fledged movement for independence and a new nation grounded in the principles of liberty and self-government. The legacy of early colonial self-governance did not end with independence. It became the foundation upon which the United States was built. When the Founding Fathers drafted the Constitution in 1787, They drew directly from the political experiences and principles developed during the colonial period. The ideas of representative government, separation of powers, checks and balances, and the rule of law had already been tested in colonial legislatures and town meetings. These concepts were not abstract theories. They were living traditions, shaped by generations of colonists who had governed themselves in practice. The Bill of Rights, added shortly after the Constitution's ratification, further echoed colonial concerns by guaranteeing fundamental liberties such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press, and protection from arbitrary government power. These rights mirrored the long-standing colonial belief that individual freedoms must be protected from centralized authority. The influence of these early democratic experiments continues to this day. Town meetings still operate in parts of New England, offering a direct, grassroots model of democracy. State constitutions reflect the federal structure first explored in colonial charters, balancing local authority with a broader national framework. Civic participation through voting, public debate, community leadership, and local government service remains a vital part of American life. The colonial period taught Americans to expect a voice in their governance and to view political involvement not just as a right, but as a civic duty. This enduring legacy reminds us that democracy in America was not suddenly born in 1776. It was nurtured over decades of colonial struggle, shaped by everyday people who believed in their capacity to rule themselves, and carried forward into the institutions that define the United States today. The story of American democracy begins not just with the Constitution, but with the everyday decisions, documents, and institutions of the colonial era. From the Mayflower Compact to town meetings, from the House of Burgesses to the passionate debates inspired by Enlightenment thinkers, these early experiments in self-governance laid the essential groundwork for the nation's founding ideals. They showed that democracy was possible, that people could govern themselves, and that government should exist to serve the rights and will of the people. Now, I want to hear from you. Which colonial document or event do you think had the biggest impact on shaping American democracy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you love uncovering the deeper roots of American history, make sure to like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe for more fascinating stories from the past. Thanks for watching.